My name is Lucas, and I've worked a night shift at the Iron Bell Tavern for almost a decade. It's a quiet bar, tucked away on a forgotten street, where the neon sign barely flickers, and the wooden floors creak under the weight of time. But there's one rule here that everyone follows. When the clock strikes 3 a.m., and the bell above the door rings on its own, you do not turn around. It's an old bell, rusted and cracked, hanging just above the entrance. Nobody touches it, and yet, every night, at exactly 3 a.m., it chimes. Not loudly, not in a way that would wake the dead. Just a soft, eerie ring, like a whisper of metal against the silence. Most of the regulars know the rule. Some cover their ears, some stare at their drinks, but nobody ever turns to look, because those who do, they don't come back. The first time I saw it happen, it was a guy named Richie. He was a trucker, passing through town, grabbing a drink before hitting the road again. He wasn't the superstitious type, laughed at the warnings from the old-timers. "What's the worst that could happen?" he said, smirking over his beer. I didn't answer, just kept wiping down the bar, pretending I wasn't counting the minutes. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., the bell rang. Richie turned. The moment he did, his smirk vanished. His face drained of color. His hands trembled. He took a step back, his chair scraping against the floor. "What the hell?" he started, but his voice cut off. He dropped his drink, shattering the glass against the counter. Then, in complete silence, he turned and walked straight out of the bar. We never saw him again. His truck stayed parked outside until the morning. Someone eventually came to tow it away, but Richie himself was never found. I wanted to believe it was just coincidence. Maybe he had somewhere to be. Maybe he got spooked by his own shadow. But then it happened again, and again. Different people, same reaction. A curious glance over the shoulder, a look of pure horror, and then they were gone. Always at 3 a.m., always after the bell rang. Last night, I made a mistake. It was just after 2:59 a.m., and I was alone at the bar, wiping down the last of the glasses. The place was empty. No customers, no regulars, just me and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. And then the bell rang. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The urge to turn was overwhelming. The air felt thick, pressing against my skin. My fingers clenched around the rag in my hand. I stared at the reflection in the bar mirror, trying to catch a glimpse without turning, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, tall, impossibly thin, standing just inside the doorway. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, watching me. I couldn't see its face, only the way the air seemed to twist around it, the way the light flickered as if struggling to exist. In its presence, my heart pounded. My throat was dry. I kept my hands steady, kept my breathing slow, and whispered to myself, "Don't turn around, don't turn around." Then, the whisper came. Lucas. My name, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. The shadow didn't move, didn't breathe. It just waited. The clock ticked. The neon sign outside buzzed. And then, just as suddenly as it came, the presence vanished. The air lightened. My body relaxed. The silence returned. I didn't turn until the sun rose. Now, I know one thing for sure. The bell doesn't just ring for anyone. It rings for those who are next. My name is James, and I run the Blackwood Tavern, a bar that has stood for nearly a century. It has its fair share of ghost stories, but there's one that the regulars never joke about. The table in the far left corner, no one sits there. Not even on the busiest nights, when the bar is packed, when people are practically fighting for a stool. If someone new tries, they're quickly warned by the regulars. That table belongs to him, they say. I never questioned it much. Superstitions run deep in old places like this. But last week, something happened that changed everything. A traveler came in late one evening, a man in his 40s, dressed in a heavy coat. He looked exhausted, like someone who had been driving too long. He ordered a beer, then scanned the room for a seat. Every stool was taken, every table filled except one, the far left table. Before I could warn him, he walked over and sat down. The entire bar went silent. Regulars exchanged uneasy glances. I took a step forward, ready to tell him to move, but then I hesitated. Maybe it was time to put this nonsense to rest. It's just a damn table, right? The man didn't seem to notice the shift in the atmosphere. He sipped his beer, pulled out his phone, and started scrolling. The room gradually returned to life. Conversations resumed. The jukebox hummed an old tune, and I went back to pouring drinks. And then, the man spoke, not to anyone in particular, not to anyone at all. At first I thought he was on the phone. His voice was low, murmuring. But when I looked closer, I saw his phone screen was off. He wasn't talking into a mic, and he wasn't calling anyone. His fingers drummed nervously against the wood. His eyes darted around like he was listening to something none of us could hear. Then he laughed, a quiet, breathy chuckle, like someone had whispered a joke in his ear. The hairs on my arm stood up. A few of the regulars muttered under their breath, gripping their drinks tighter. The man suddenly stiffened. His head jerked up, his eyes wide. His fingers dug into the table. I have to go," he stammered. He pushed his chair back so fast that it scraped against the floor with a shriek. He turned, bolting for the door, nearly knocking over a waitress on his way out. The bar fell into silence once more. The regulars slowly turned to look at the table. I followed their gaze. My stomach dropped. The man's half finished. Beer was still there, but his chair wasn't. It had been pulled back into place, neatly tucked under the table, like he had never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I asked old Walter, the oldest customer we have, about the table. He sighed and took a long sip of his whiskey. "It used to belong to a man named Victor," he said. "Came in every night, sat right there. One night, he just dropped dead, heart attack. Ever since then, nobody sits there." I nodded, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. "That doesn't explain what happened last night." Walter looked me dead in the eye. "Victor never liked sharing his seat. I haven't touched that table since, and I don't think I ever will, because every morning, when I unlock the bar, the chairs are always neatly tucked in, the way Victor left them." My name is Adam, and I tend the bar at the Hollow Oak, a place with more stories than customers. The walls are lined with old photographs. Dimly lit chandeliers dangle from the ceiling, and behind me, an enormous antique mirror dominates the back wall. It's been there since the bar first opened over 100 years ago. It was always just a part of the until last week. It started with a man named Russell, a regular who had been drinking here for years. One night, as I wiped down the counter, he let out a strangled gasp. I turned to see him staring into the mirror, pale as death. "What's wrong?" I asked. Russell swallowed hard, his eyes locked onto the glass. "That's not my reflection," he whispered. I glanced at the mirror. Russell sat on his usual stool, but his reflection, it didn't match. In the mirror, he was still sitting there, but his movements weren't synchronized with reality. The mirrored version of Russell was grinning wide, unnatural, and menacing. His real self was frozen in horror. Then, the reflection moved. Before he did, he stumbled backward off the stool, nearly tripping over himself as he bolted for the door. "I'm never coming back here," he yelled over his shoulder, and he never did. At first I thought he had just been too drunk, maybe seeing things. But then, a woman named Clara had a similar reaction. One night, she was fixing her hair using the mirror when she suddenly went rigid. Her reflection was still moving, combing through invisible strands of hair, long after she had stopped. She ran out without paying for her drink. That's when I started paying attention. I began watching the mirror more closely. I noticed the way my own reflection lagged behind by just a fraction of a second. How it sometimes turned its head when I hadn't. I tested it, waving my hand in front of my face. Most of the time, it mirrored me perfectly. Most of the time. One night, after closing, I stood alone in the bar, staring at the mirror. The bar stools behind me were empty, the lights dimmed to a flickering glow. My reflection stood perfectly still. Even when I stepped forward, my breath hitched. I raised my hand and my reflection didn't move. A voice, barely a whisper, rasped from the other side of the glass. "Let me out." I stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest. The reflection's mouth curled into a slow, predatory grin. "It's cold in here, Adam." The lights flickered. The air in the room became thick, heavy, like something was pressing in on me. I turned and ran for the exit, slamming the door behind me. The next day, I told the owner, Walter, about what had been happening. He sighed like he'd been waiting for this conversation. "That mirror's been here longer than I have," he said. "Longer than my father. My grandfather used to say it doesn't just reflect sometimes. It keeps things." "Keeps things?" I asked, my stomach twisting. Walter nodded. "People say if you look into it long enough, something else looks back." I wanted to take the mirror down, throw it out, smash it into 1,000 pieces. But Walter wouldn't let me. "It's part of the bar," he said, like that explained anything. Last night, I covered the mirror with a black sheet. But when I turned off the lights and started locking up, I heard something behind me. A muffled tapping sound, like knuckles rapping against glass. I didn't turn around. I didn't check. I locked the door and walked out without looking back. But I know it's still there, waiting. And I know that one day, someone will look too long, and the mirror will decide to keep them. My name is Ethan, and I have been bartending at O'Malley's for the past 6 years. It's a quiet little place on the edge of town, the kind of bar where people come to forget their worries. But lately, something deeply unsettling has been happening. Customers are disappearing. It started about 2 weeks ago. Regulars who used to come in every night suddenly stopped showing up. At first, I didn't think much of it. People move, get new jobs, find new places to drink. But then I noticed something strange. Their bar tabs were still open, glasses left half full, jackets hanging on coat hooks, even unfinished conversations mid-sentence. It was as if they had just stepped outside for a smoke and never came back. One night, I mentioned it to my boss, Charlie. He just shrugged and said, "People come and go, Ethan. That's the way of things." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. So, I decided to check the security footage. What I saw chilled me to the bone. In the grainy black and white footage, I watched as one of our regulars, a guy named Mike, sat at the bar chatting with me. But then, in the middle of our conversation, he simply vanished. One frame, he was there. The next, he was gone. No struggle, no sign of distress. Just gone, as if he had never existed. I rewound the footage, played it again, frame by frame. The same thing happened with Claire, an elderly woman who always sat by the jukebox, and Jeremy, a young guy who drank whiskey neat. One second, they were there, the next, they weren't. I didn't sleep that night. The next evening, I made sure to keep my eyes on every patron. The bar was nearly empty, just a few regulars, nursing their drinks. At around 11:30, I turned away for just a second, to grab a bottle, and when I turned back, one of them was gone. Their seat was empty, the beer bottle still dripping with condensation. My heart pounded as I checked the security camera live feed. Just like before, one second they were there, the next they were gone. I tried calling the missing people. Number answer. I checked their social media. No activity. It was as if they had never existed. By the end of the week, The bar was almost empty. Only a handful of people still came in, unaware that those who did never seemed to leave. Then, last night, something even worse happened. At around midnight, a man I had never seen before walked in. He wore a long black coat, his face obscured by the dim light. He sat at the end of the bar, folding his hands in front of him. "Whiskey," he murmured. His voice was like the scraping of dry leaves. I poured his drink, my hands trembling. Something about him felt off. He didn't sip his drink. Instead, he just watched the room, watched me. Then, he spoke again. "You see them, don't you?" he said. My blood ran cold. "See who?" I asked. He smiled, a slow, eerie grin. "The ones who leave?" I backed away. "Where do they go?" His smile widened. "They're still here. You just don't know how to look." Before I could say another word, he vanished right before my eyes. The glass he had held clattered onto the bar, empty. I stood frozen, my mind spinning. If what he said was true, the missing weren't gone. They were still here, unseen, trapped in some unknown space. Tonight, I'm closing the bar early. I don't care what Charlie says. I need to get out of here before I become the next one to disappear. My name is Daniel, and I've been working at the Rusty Lantern for about 3 years now. It's the kind of bar where the regulars have their own stools, and the jukebox still plays scratched-up records from decades past. But lately, something strange has been happening. People who order a certain drink never come back. It all started about a month ago. An old man named Frank, one of our usuals, walked in one rainy night. He always ordered the same thing, a bourbon on the rocks. But that night, something was different. He hesitated, scanning the menu like he'd never seen it before. Then, his finger landed on a drink I didn't even recognize the last sip. I frowned. We didn't have a drink called that. I flipped through the cocktail list, but it wasn't there. I looked back at Frank, ready to ask if he was joking, but his eyes were locked onto me, his face pale. "Just make me something strong," he murmured. I shrugged, mixed him his usual, and slid it across the bar. He lifted the glass, took a long sip, and then he just sat there, silent, still. His breathing slowed. A strange emptiness filled his gaze. Then, without a word, he stood up, left his drink half finished, and walked out the door. Frank never came back. I tried calling him the next day, but his phone was disconnected. No one in town had seen him since. I told myself it was a coincidence. He had moved away. Maybe something had happened. But then, a week later, it happened again. A woman named Leela sat at the bar, flipping through the menu. "I'll have the last sip," she said. A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Where did you hear about that?" I asked. She looked confused. "It's right here, on the menu." I grabbed the menu from her and scanned it. There was no such drink listed. My hands felt clammy as I handed it back to her. "I think you're mistaken. How about a classic old-fashioned?" She hesitated, then nodded. I made her drink, and just like Frank, she took one sip, went unnervingly quiet, and walked out the door. By the third time it happened, I knew this was no coincidence. It was a pattern. A man named Todd ordered the last sip, and though I tried to steer him toward something else, he insisted he saw it on the menu. I watched him take a sip, his expression going blank as if something had drained the life out of him. And just like the others, he left, never to be seen again. I started keeping track. In the last month, 8 people had ordered the drink. 8 people had vanished. Last night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I printed out a copy of the menu and combed through it, line by line. The last sip was nowhere to be found, but when I held it up to the light, faint letters shimmered beneath the ink. Words that had been erased, but not completely. It was there. Hidden dot, My heart pounded as I traced my fingers over the ghostly imprint of the words. The bar felt colder, the air heavier. Then, just as I was about to set the menu down, the bar's old rotary phone rang. I hesitated before picking up. "Rusty Lantern, this is Daniel." A dry, hollow voice whispered on the other end. "Have you taken your last sip?" A chill ran down my spine. I slammed the phone down, my pulse racing. I turned to the shelf behind me, scanning the bottles. The idea clawed at my brain. What if I made it? What if I poured myself the last sip? I reached for a glass. My hands shook as I grabbed the bourbon, the bitters, the sugar. I mixed the drink, the liquid swirling like ink in the dim bar light. I lifted the glass to my lips, and then I saw them. Reflected in the rows of bottles behind the bar, faces stared back at me. Hollow, distant, their eyes filled with something beyond fear. Frank, Lila, Todd, all of them. My grip on the glass tightened. Their mouths moved in silent screams, their hands reaching out from beyond the reflection. My throat closed up. My vision blurred. I dropped the glass, the drink spilling across the counter. The faces flickered, then vanished. I don't know what's happening in this bar. I don't know where they went, or why that drink keeps appearing. But I do know one thing. I will never take that last sip. My name is Mark, and I recently moved into an old apartment complex, one of those buildings that has been around for over a century. It has charm, sure, but it also has something else, something in the basement. The first time I heard the whispers, I had just settled in. The pipes in this place were ancient, so I chalked it up to water running through them, old metal shifting with temperature changes. But as the days passed, I realized the sounds weren't random. They were voices, at night. When everything was quiet, I would hear them. Soft, murmuring whispers drifting up through the vents. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were there. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself it was just the way the pipes carried sound. Maybe someone in another apartment was talking, and the acoustics distorted their voices. Then, one night, I heard my name. "Mark, come down." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The voice had been faint, distant, but unmistakable. I threw off the covers and checked the vents, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe it was my imagination. But then, it came again. "Mark, we see you." A shiver ran down my spine. I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs. The basement was nothing special, just a dusty room with old storage units and the building's boiler system. The pipes crisscrossed the ceiling like veins, stretching deep into the walls. As I stood there, listening, the whispers stopped. Silence, heavy, suffocating. Then, a slow, steady drip. I turned toward the farthest wall, where the old pipes twisted, down into the ground. Water was pooling beneath them, but there was something wrong with it. It wasn't clear, it was dark, thick. I stepped closer and shined my flashlight on it. It wasn't water, it was blood. I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat. The pipes groaned, metal twisting as if something inside them was moving. The whispers returned, louder this time. Overlapping voices, hissing secrets I couldn't understand. Then, the pipes started knocking, loud, insistent, like something was trying to get out. I ran. I locked my apartment door, turned up the TV, and convinced myself it wasn't real. Maybe a burst pipe had mixed with rust. Maybe I was just hearing the old building creak. But that night, as I lay in bed, I felt it. The air in my room was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew and rust. I turned my head, and in the dim glow of the streetlight outside, I saw it, a figure, hunched over, emerging from the vent near the floor. Its skin was slick and gray, its mouth stretched too wide, its eyes hollow and dripping black. And then, in a voice made of 1,000 whispers, it spoke. "We live in the pipes." I don't remember screaming. I don't remember how I got out of my apartment. But I left that building that night and never went back. Days later, I saw a moving truck outside. Someone else was moving in. I wanted to warn them, but as I stood across the street, frozen in fear, I heard the pipes, knocking, whispering, calling a new name. My name is Kevin, and I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories, monsters, shadows lurking in the dark, it was all nonsense to me. Until the night something crawled out of my basement. I had just moved into a new house, an old rental, with a damp smell and a basement that I swore was colder than the rest of the house. The landlord said it was just poor insulation. I didn't think much of it at first. Then, the noises started at night, when everything was still. I would hear something moving below. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, like nails dragging across concrete. At first, I figured it was just rats or maybe old pipes settling. But one night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something. The sound wasn't coming from beneath the floor. It was coming from the walls. I sat up, heart pounding. The noise slithered through the house, moving from one side of my bedroom to the other. I held my breath, listening. Then, for the first time, I heard it breathe. Shallow, raspy, too close. I leaped out of bed and turned on every light in the house. The sound stopped immediately, swallowed by the artificial glow. I forced myself to calm down. It had to be my imagination, stress, lack of sleep. The next day, I went down to the basement to check for any signs of rodents. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, and the air was thick with damp earth. A single, dim light bulb flickered overhead as I looked around. Old boxers, rusted pipes, nothing out of the ordinary. Then I noticed something in the farthest corner of the basement, just beyond the light's reach. There was a hole, not a crack in the foundation, not a forgotten vent. A hole, about the size of a manhole cover, leading into absolute darkness. I hadn't seen it before, and yet, the edges looked worn, used. Something had crawled through. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my phone and shined the flashlight into the hole, but the beam barely penetrated. The blackness inside was thick, unnatural, as if the light was being swallowed whole. And then, deep within that darkness, something moved. A hand too long, too thin reached forward. Fingers like broken twigs curled against the ground. Another hand followed, then a shoulder, a head, pulling itself free from the void. I couldn't see its face, only the shape of it, unfolding, stretching, its body shifting like liquid shadow. I ran. I flew up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I locked it, shoving a chair beneath the handle for good measure. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then I heard it, the slow, deliberate scraping sound. It wasn't coming from the basement anymore. It was crawling up the stairs. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the front door, leaving everything behind. I never went back. The landlord never called about missed rent. The house still stands, abandoned now, the basement door hanging slightly ajar. And at night, if you get too close, you can still hear it, crawling, waiting. My name is Jake, and I recently bought a fixer-upper house on the outskirts of town. It's old, creaky, and full of quirks, but I was excited to make it my own. The first few weeks were uneventful until I discovered the stairs. They weren't on the blueprint. They weren't supposed to be there. It happened when I was clearing out the basement. I had just finished stacking some old boxes against the far wall, when my foot hit something hollow. Confused, I moved the boxes aside, revealing a trap door I had never noticed before. I pried it open, and beneath it was a staircase. The air that rushed out was thick and stale, like it had been sealed for decades. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness below. I leaned in, shining the light down the steps. The wood was old, splintered, and covered in dust, but the strangest thing was how deep the staircase went. It spiraled down, disappearing into the shadows far below what should have been the foundation of the house. I should have closed the door. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I took the first step, then another. My footsteps echoed strangely, swallowed up by the dark. The deeper I went, the colder it became, and the air grew damp, thick with the scent of earth, and something else, something rotten. After what felt like minutes, my flashlight flickered. I smacked it against my palm, and for a split second, as the light blinked out, I swore I saw something move at the bottom of the stairs. Then, the light returned, and the stairs behind me were gone. I spun around, heart hammering. The steps I had just descended had vanished, replaced by a smooth, unbroken wall of stone. Panic surged through me. I was trapped. I turned back toward the bottom of the stairs. The passage stretched on into the darkness, impossibly long now, and then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere ahead. I swallowed my fear and aimed the flashlight forward. "Hello." My voice was small, swallowed by the void. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Then, a whisper. Low, hoarse, just inches from my ear. "You don't belong here." The air turned ice cold. I turned and ran, sprinting toward where the stairs had been, slamming my fists against the stone wall. "Let me out," I screamed. The whisper came, again, this time right behind me. "Go deeper." I refused to turn around. I pounded against the wall with everything I had. And then a hand gripped my wrist. Cold, bony fingers wrapped around my skin, yanking me back. My flashlight slipped from my grip, clattering to the floor. In its dim glow, I saw them figures emerging from the shadows, pale, hollow-eyed, their mouths stretched too wide, their hands reaching for me. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in my basement, the trapdoor sealed shut beneath me. My hands were bloody from clawing at the wall. I don't know how long I was down there. I moved out the next morning, but at night, I still dream of the stairs, and I still hear the whisper calling me back. My name is Daniel, and I live in a small apartment on the second floor of an old building. It's nothing fancy, but it's home. The rent is cheap, and the neighbors are quieter, at least, most of them are. The tenant below me, though, he's different. At first, I barely noticed him. The door to the basement apartment was always locked, the lights always off. I never saw him come or go, but late at night, I would hear things, scraping sounds, heavy breathing. Sometimes, I could swear I heard whispering, like someone talking to themselves just beneath my feet. I tried to ignore it. Everyone has their quirks, right? But then the smell started. A rancid, rotting odor seeped up through the floorboards. It was faint at first, but within days, it became unbearable. Like meat left out in the sun for too long. I complained to the landlord, but he just shrugged. "There's no tenant down there," he said. I laughed, thinking he was joking. But when I saw his face pale, serious, uneasy, I felt a chill creep over me. That night, the noises got worse. Something heavy dragged across the floor beneath me. Slow, deliberate movements. Then, tapping, rhythmic like fingernails against wood. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and then, for the first time, I heard a voice. "Let me in." I froze. It had come from the vent near the floor. A rasping whisper, barely audible. I scrambled out of bed, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. My fingers trembled as I knelt by the vent, peering inside. The darkness beyond seemed endless, stretching far beyond where it should. Then, something moved. A pale, thin hand shot forward, pressing against the metal grating from the other side. I stumbled backward. A scream caught in my throat. The fingers twitched, pressing harder, bending the vent cover outward. The voice came again, desperate now. "Let me in." I ran out of my apartment and pounded on the landlord's door. He answered, groggy and annoyed, but when I told him what I saw, his expression darkened. "You need to leave," he said. "What?" I stammered. "You don't understand. There's something I understand," he cut in. "That apartment was sealed off years ago. No one has lived there since the last tenant." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "It's not safe. Get out while you still can." I didn't sleep that night. The noises continued, scratching, dragging, whispering. But now, they were inside my walls. By morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't care about my deposit. I didn't care about my belongings. I just needed to get away. As I walked down the street, I glanced back one last time at the building. The basement window was open, and someone was watching me from the darkness within. I turned and never looked back. My name is Eric, and I recently moved into my grandfather's old house. It's a large, creaky thing, sitting at the edge of town, the kind of place kids tell ghost stories about. I never believed in that kind of thing until I discovered the locked door in the basement. I had been in the basement dozens of times as a kid, but I never remembered seeing that door before. It was old, made of thick oak, with a rusted iron handle. It didn't match the rest of the house, as if it had been added long after the place was built. And no matter how hard I pulled, pushed, or rammed against it, the door wouldn't budge. Curiosity got the best of me. I searched the entire house for key drawers, cabinets, even under floorboards. Nothing. Eventually, I gave up and called a locksmith. When the locksmith arrived, he barely glanced at the door before shaking his head. "Sorry, I can't help you," I frowned. "Why not?" He hesitated, looking almost embarrassed. "This door, it shouldn't be here." I laughed. "It's obviously here. Can you open it or not?" The locksmith didn't answer. He turned and left, refusing payment. That's when I started to feel uneasy. That night, I heard something coming from the basement. A slow, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against wood. At first, I convinced myself it was the house settling, an old pipe knocking against the wall, but the tapping continued, and then came the whispering. It was faint, almost impossible to hear, but I knew it was there. Words just beyond my understanding, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was determined to break the door down. I grabbed a crowbar and went to the basement. The air was thick, heavy, like the whole house was holding its breath. I wedged the crowbar into the frame and pushed with all my strength. The wood groaned, cracked, and then the door opened. Behind it was darkness, not the kind you get in a room without windows. This was something deeper, something unnatural. The walls were lined with stone, rough and uneven, like an ancient tunnel leading underground. A staircase disappeared into the blackness below. A smell hit me, a mix of earth, mold, and something else. Something rotten. I should have closed the door. I should have walked away. But I stepped forward. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The air grew colder with each step. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling down and down until I lost all sense of how far I'd gone. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were scratch marks on the stone walls. Deep, desperate grooves, as if someone had tried to claw their way back up. The further I went, the fresher they looked. Then I saw the first skeleton, a pile of bones, crumpled against the wall. The skull was cracked, as if it had been crushed. I turned to run, but the stairs were gone. The way up had vanished, swallowed by the darkness. A breath hot and wet brushed against my ear. "You should have left it locked." Something grabbed my wrist. I screamed, yanking my arm free, running into the darkness, blind and panicked. I don't remember how, but suddenly, I was back in my basement, gasping for air. The door slamming shut behind me. I nailed it shut. I sealed it with concrete. But at night, I still hear it. The tapping, the whispers. And I know that one day, the door will open again. My name is Dylan, and I haven't stepped foot in an abandoned place since that night. It was supposed to be a joke, just me, my friends Olivia, Marcus, and Tyler, killing time on a summer night. We were driving around when Marcus brought it up the old playground on the east side of town. I heard if you go there at night, you can still hear the kids playing, he said, grinning. Dude, that place has been abandoned for years, Tyler scoffed. It's just a bunch of rusted swings. Exactly, Marcus pressed. So why are people still hearing laughter? We should have turned around right then. The playground was tucked behind a grove of dead trees, hidden from the road. The moment we stepped out of the car, I felt that the air was too still. No wind, no crickets, just silence. The equipment stood frozen in time, a merry-go-round covered in rust, a row of empty swings, a slide so worn it barely held together, and in the center of it all was the carousel, peeling paint, missing horses. The platform tilted slightly to one side, as if sinking into the earth. But what caught my attention was the sign above it, barely hanging on by a single nail. No playing. After dark. Creepy, Olivia muttered. You think it still works? Marcus didn't hesitate. He climbed onto the carousel and gave it a push. It groaned, metal screeching against metal as it started to spin, and then we heard it laughter, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Did you hear that? Tyler whispered. We turned, expecting to see someone behind us, but we were alone. Then the swings started moving, not swaying with the wind. There was no wind. They moved as if someone was sitting in them, pushing off the ground. The chains creaked in slow, rhythmic squeaks. The laughter grew louder. Olivia grabbed my arm. Dylan, let's go. Then Marcus screamed. We spun around. He was on the carousel, but something was wrong. He wasn't pushing it anymore. It was spinning on its own. Faster, faster. Marcus clung to the metal bars, his face pale, terror in his eyes. I can't get off. We ran to grab him, but the second our hands touched the carousel, the laughter stopped. Everything was silent again, and Marcus was gone. The carousel slowed to a stop, empty, nothing but the sound of our own ragged breathing. We searched the entire playground. Marcus was nowhere. No footprints, no sign that he had ever been there at all. Tyler cursed under his breath, pulling out his phone to call the cops. No signal. Let's just get to the car, Olivia cried. We bolted, sprinting for the road. But when we reached the car, Marcus was there, standing perfectly still. Marcus, I gasped. Where the hell did you go? He didn't answer. He just smiled, a slow, unnatural grin stretching too wide across his face. Then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he whispered, "No playing after dark." The next thing I remember, we were driving away, speeding down the road. No one spoke. No one looked back. The next day, Marcus was gone. His house was empty. His parents swore they never had a son named Marcus. The only proof he ever existed was a missing person poster that was no longer there. But sometimes, when I pass by that abandoned playground, I see a figure sitting on the carousel, and when it starts to spin, I hear him laughing. My name is Ethan, and I don't go hiking anymore. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me, my girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Mason and Lily. We wanted to escape the city for a while, breathe fresh air, sit by a campfire. Mason picked the spot. Black Hollow Forest. A bit remote, but peaceful. Or so we thought. The first day was fine. We set up camp near a stream, roasted marshmallows, told dumb ghost stories. But that night, something changed. It started with a noise, a distant, rhythmic knocking that echoed through the trees. 3 knocks, then silence. Lily laughed nervously. Maybe it's just a woodpecker. Sarah frowned. At this hour, the second night, we found the cabin. We had wandered deeper into the woods, looking for a good hiking trail, when we spotted it a small wooden cabin, barely visible between the trees. It wasn't on any map. No roads led to it. "Let's check it out," Mason said. Everything about it felt wrong. The windows were boarded up. The wood was old, gray, and splintered, as if it had been there for centuries. There was no path leading up to it, just trees. Then we saw the door, wide open. "Someone could be living here," I warned. "We should leave." But Mason had already stepped inside. The air was thick, stale, too still. Dust floated in the weak sunlight that streamed through the cracks in the walls. Inside, there was nothing, no furniture, no belongings, just a single wooden chair in the center of the room, and the walls. They were covered in scratch marks, deep, desperate gouges that ran from the floor to the ceiling. Then we heard it. The knocking. 3 knocks. This time, from inside the cabin. We spun around, but the doorway was empty. The forest beyond was silent, the trees swaying as if whispering among themselves. Mason swallowed hard. "Let's get out of here," he muttered. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached camp, panting, hearts hammering in our chests. That night, none of us slept, because at exactly 3 a.m., the knocking returned. 3 knocks on our tent. Mason unzipped the tent just an inch, shining his flashlight outside. There was no one there, but in the dirt just beyond our tent, footprints led from the cabin and stopped right at the entrance. The next morning, we packed up and left. As we drove away, I glanced back at the tree line, half expecting to see the cabin watching us, but it wasn't there, as if it had never existed at all. My name is Alex, and I should have never gone near that factory. It started as a stupid adventure, one last thrill, before we all went our separate ways for college. My friends in Eliam, Jenna, and Christy decided to explore the old Blackridge steel factory, abandoned for over 50 years. It had a reputation. Workers had gone missing back when it was still running, and one day, the entire crew on the night shift disappeared without a trace. No bodies, no evidence, just gone. We laughed it off. Urban legends, right? The factory loomed in the distance as we approached, its skeletal remains swallowed by rust and decay. The air smelled of damp metal and something stale, like the scent of old machinery left to rot. The front gates were chained shut, but Liam found a hole in the fence. "Told you it'd be easy," he grinned. The inside was worse than I expected. Conveyor belts frozen in time, shattered glass crunching beneath our feet. Graffiti covered the walls, but there was something strange about its warnings. "Turn back," they never left. "It watches." Jenna shivered. "Guys, maybe we shouldn't be here." Chris chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, it's just some edgy kids messing around." Then the lights flickered. I thought it was a trick of the eye. There was no way the factory still had power, but the long-dead overhead lights buzzed weakly, casting sickly, uneven glows across the rusted machinery. Then we heard it. A metal clang, like something had just shifted in the darkness ahead. Liam whispered, "Did you hear that?" We turned a corner, and there it was, a doorway that hadn't been there before. It was embedded in the back wall, a heavy steel door slightly ajar, revealing only blackness beyond. The nameplate above it was rusted, the words unreadable. Every instinct in my body screamed to leave. But Liam, being Liam, pushed the door open wider. "Holy shit," he breathed. Inside was a perfectly preserved control room. Unlike the rest of the factory, there was no dust, no signs of decay. Screens lined the walls, flickering with static. Dials and switches remained untouched, as if someone had been here just moments before. Then, the screens changed. One by one, they lit up, displaying grainy black and white security footage of us from behind. I spun around, nothing was there. Then, Chris screamed. I turned just in time to see him being dragged through the doorway. The steel door slammed shut behind him. We ran to it, yanking at the handle, pounding on the metal. Chris, the factory rumbled. The lights flickered wildly. Then, silence. The door swung open. The room was empty. The monitors were blank. The switches were covered in rust, like it had been abandoned for decades. Chris was gone. We ran. We didn't stop until we were back in Liam's car, speeding down the highway, the factory shrinking in the rearview mirror. The next day, we reported Chris missing. The police searched the factory. They found nothing. No control room. No steel door. No sign that Chris had ever been there. But sometimes, when my TV glitches out late at night, I swear, I see him standing in the static, watching. My name is Carter, and last summer, my friends and I made the mistake of staying at an abandoned motel on the outskirts of town. It was supposed to be a joke, a fun night of ghost stories and cheap thrills. Instead, it turned into something none of us could explain. The Sunset Pines Motel had been closed for over a decade. The locals said it was because of a murderer guest who checked in and was never seen again. The owner vanished the same night. After that, no one dared to reopen the place. My friend Jake found it on some urban exploration forum, and before I knew it, we were on our way. The building loomed in the moonlight, its faded neon sign buzzing faintly despite the years of neglect. Most of the windows were broken, and the front desk was covered in a thick layer of dust. The key rack still hung on the wall, most of the keys missing, except for one. Room 109. Jake grabbed it with a grin. Looks like we found our room. We laughed it off, pushing away the creeping unease, settling in our chests. The door to 109 groaned open, revealing a room frozen in time-faded floral wallpaper, a stained mattress, a flickering lamp that shouldn't have been working. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. Creepy as hell, Megan muttered. That's why we're here, Jake shot back, tossing his bag onto the bed. The night started off as expected. We cracked open beers, told scary stories, dared each other to walk the empty halls. But as the hours passed, something changed. The temperature dropped. The air became heavy. Then, the TV turned on by itself. The screen was filled with static, the speakers crackling with white noise. Then, the picture shifted. It was security footage of our room. The grainy image showed us sitting on the bed, staring at the screen in horror. But there was something wrong. There was someone else in the room with us. A tall, gaunt figure stood in the far corner watching. Its face was obscured by shadows, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally. The static grew louder, warping into something that almost sounded like breathing. Then the screen cut to black. We need to go. Now. My voice shook as I scrambled to grab my things. Jake hesitated, laughing nervously. Guys, it's just a prank then. The bathroom door creaked open. No one had gone in there all night. A low wheezing sound filled the room. A shadow stretched across the floor, moving toward us, but nothing was casting it. Megan screamed. I grabbed her hand and bolted for the door. Jake was right behind us until he wasn't. We turned just in time to see him being pulled back into the dark. The door slammed shut behind him. We pounded on it, screaming his name. Silence. Then, the TV flickered back on. The footage showed Jake, alone in the room, staring at the camera with wide, empty eyes. Then, he smiled. The screen cut to black. The room door swung open. Jake was gone. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached the car, speeding away without looking back. The next morning, we called the cops. They found no sign of Jake. But in room 109, the TV was still on, static hissing through the speakers. And on the dusty floor, scratched into the wood, were the words, "Stay the night." My name is Josh, and I've always had a thing for urban exploration. Abandoned buildings, forgotten places, the eerie silence of places left behind. It all fascinated me. But after what happened last summer, I don't explore anymore. It started as a dare. My friends and I, Emily, Ryan, and Jesty, decided to check out an old asylum on the edge of town. Blackwood Asylum had been shut down for decades, its history filled with rumors of mistreatment and disappearances. People said that patients never really left, that their screams could still be heard at night. We laughed it off. Ghost stories didn't scare us. The asylum was massive, looming in the moonlight, its windows shattered, vines creeping through the cracks in the brickwork. The rusted front gate hung open, almost inviting us in. We stepped inside, our flashlights barely cutting through the dust-choked air. The smell of mildew and something rotten hit us immediately. Creepy as hell, Jess muttered. Ryan grinned. That's the point. We made our way through the main hall, past overturned wheelchairs and rusted gurneys. The walls were lined with peeling patient records, yellowed with age. As we moved deeper into the asylum, an uneasy feeling settled over me. Then we heard it. A soft, rustling sound. Footsteps, light, deliberate, just around the corner. We froze. No one was supposed to be here, Emily whispered. Did you hear that? Before anyone could answer, Ryan did what he always did. He ran toward the noise. Dude, don't, I started, but he was already gone. The rest of us exchanged nervous glances before following him. We turned a corner and saw a long hallway stretching into darkness. Ryan was standing at the end, facing an open doorway. There's something in here, he whispered. A chill crawled up my spine. We stepped closer, peering into the room. It looked like an old therapy ward beds, with rusted restraints, broken mirrors lining the walls, and in the center of the room stood a chair, its leather straps still fastened, as if waiting for its next patient. Then the door slammed shut. Emily screamed. Jess grabbed the handle and yanked, but it wouldn't budge. Ryan pounded on the door from the inside. Guys, get me out. We threw our weight against it, but it was like the door had fused to the frame. Then, behind us, a voice whispered, "Leave." My blood ran cold. We turned. The chair was no longer empty. A figure sat in it now, head tilted unnaturally, its hollow eyes locked onto us, its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide. Jess yanked on the door handle, sobbing. "Please, please," Ryan screamed from inside the room. His flashlight flickered wildly, shadows stretching unnaturally against the walls. The figure stood up, then everything went dark. The next thing I remember, we were outside, gasping, trembling. The asylum behind us stood silent, undisturbed, as if it had never let us in. But Ryan was gone. We called the police. They searched the building. No sign of him, no footprints, no belongings, nothing. Like he had never existed. A week later, I got a text from his number. One word: help. I didn't respond. I still hear him sometimes. When the night is too quiet, when the wind brushes against my window, I hear his voice begging, and I know if I ever go back, I won't come out either. My name is Nathan, and I should have never gone back to that forest. 3 years ago, my brother Matt went missing in Raven Pines, a dense, isolated forest known for swallowing hikers whole. They searched for months. No footprints, no torn clothing, nothing. It was like the woods had erased him. Last month, I returned. Not for closure, not for answers. I returned because I saw him. It was late, a storm rolling in, and I was driving past the forest when something caught my Aja figure standing just beyond the tree line, tall, motionless, watching, and even through the rain-streaked windshield, I recognized the jacket, the same one Matt had been wearing the night he vanished. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering. My brain screamed that it wasn't possible. Matt was gone, but my body moved before I could think. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the trees. Matt. My voice barely carried over the wind. The figure turned and walked deeper into the woods. I followed, I had too. The branches clawed at my jacket, the undergrowth swallowing my footsteps. The flashlight flickered as I pushed forward, his shadow moving just beyond my reach. Then, he stopped. I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. Matt's back was still to me, his head slightly tilted, like he was listening. "Matt, it's me." Slowly, he turned, and I saw his face. Or rather, the lack of one. There were no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin stretched too tightly over bone. Then, it smiled. A mouth split open where there shouldn't have been. One, wide, unnatural, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The flashlight died, and the forest erupted into whispers. Not one voice, dozens, hundreds. I ran, blind, desperate. My lungs burned as I tore through the darkness, branches whipping at my face. The whispers followed, slithering into my ears, my mind. Then, suddenly silence. I was standing on the roadside, my car's headlights illuminating the trees. The forest behind me was still, too still. I barely made it home. I locked the doors, closed the curtains, told myself it wasn't real. But last night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my window, and when I looked out, there was a figure standing in the tree line, wearing Matt's jacket. My name is Lucas, and I should have listened to the warnings about the hollow tree. Every town has its legends, and ours was no different. Deep in Blackwood Forest, there was an ancient tree, older than anything else in the woods. People said it was cursed, that anyone who looked inside would never be the same. I never believed it, until the night I did. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, me, my girlfriend Erin, and our friend Kyle. We set up camp near the river, just a few miles from where the tree supposedly stood. It was Kyle's idea to find it. "Come on," he grinned. "How often do we get to prove a legend wrong?" I hesitated, but Erin was curious too. So, we grabbed our flashlights and followed the overgrown path into the trees. The forest felt different. That night, the air was thick, heavy. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. No wind, no animals, no sound. Then, we saw it. The hollow tree. It was massive. Its bark gnarled and twisted, like something out of a nightmare. A hole gaped in its trunk, too round, too perfect, like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Kyle grinned. "I'll go first." Before we could stop him, he stepped forward, shining his flashlight inside. The second he did, he stopped moving. His breath hitched. His grip on the flashlight tightened. His whole body locked in place. "Kyle," Erin whispered. He didn't answer. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering. His eyes were wide, unblinking. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. Then, before I could react, he turned and ran. Not just ran, sprinted, straight into the forest. "Kyle," I shouted, but he didn't stop. We chased after him, our flashlights bouncing in the dark. The trees closed in around us, twisting, warping. The ground felt wrong beneath my feet, like I was stepping on something that wasn't entirely solid. Then, the whispers started, soft. Right behind us, not words, just laughter. Erin grabbed my arm. "We need to go back now." But Kyle was still ahead, running deeper into the trees. I forced myself forward until I saw him. He stood perfectly still, his back to us, facing another tree. His own shadow stretched toward him, reaching. "Kyle," I stepped forward. "We have to leave." Slowly, he turned. His eyes weren't his anymore. Dark, hollow, empty. Then, in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "It sees you now." The next thing I remember, Erin was pulling me, screaming. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached camp. Throwing ourselves into the tent, zipping it shut like that, could somehow keep it out. In the morning, Kyle was gone. The police searched for weeks. They never found him. But sometimes, when I drive past the woods at night. I see a shadow standing between the trees, and I swear, it looks just like him. My name is Daniel, and I learned the hard way that some parts of the forest are never meant to be entered. Last autumn, my friends and I, Megan, Tyler, and Josh, decided to camp near Blackwood Ridge, a remote area known for its eerie fog. The locals warned us about it. They said the mist moves on its own, that people who walk into it don't always come back. We laughed it off. We weren't laughing the next morning. The first night was cold, but normal. We built a fire, told ghost stories, and joked about the warnings. But at exactly midnight, the mist rolled in, thick, unnatural, silent. It moved like it was alive, slithering between the trees, swallowing everything in its path. The fire dimmed, as if struggling against the fog's weight. I could barely see the others, their outlines flickering like shadows in a dream. Then we heard it. A low, guttural howl. Not a wolf, not a coyote, something else, something wrong. Tyler laughed nervously. Okay, that's creepy. Josh frowned. Maybe we should. Then Megan screamed. We spun around, but she was already gone. Her flashlight lay on the ground, its beam cutting into the mist, but there was no sign of her, no sound, no struggle, just gone. We called her name. Again. The mist swallowed our voices. Then the howling came again, closer now, circling us. Run, Josh shouted. We did. We bolted through the trees, but the mist twisted the landscape. Paths shifted, trees loomed where they shouldn't be. The trail we had taken earlier was gone. Then we saw them, figures in the fog, tall, thin shapes standing motionless between the trees, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their arms too long, their fingers twitching. Then they moved, a blur of motion, a flash of pale skin, something whispering inside the mist, voices that weren't ours. Tyler tripped. I grabbed his arm, yanking him up just as the mist closed in around where he had fallen. We ran until we couldn't anymore. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the mist stopped. We were back at our camp, gasping for air, but Megan was still gone. We searched for hours, called for her until our throats were raw. The police combed the area for days. No footprints, no signs of struggle. No Megan. Just the mist. Waiting. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in at night, I still hear the howling. My name is Jake, and I haven't been back to the woods since that night. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Me, my girlfriend Emily, and our two best friends, Ben and Lisa. We had done this a dozen times before. Pick a secluded spot, set up camp, tell scary stories by the fire. But this time, we picked the wrong place. The first sign that something was off came just as the sun was setting. We had set up our tents in a small clearing beside an old hiking trail, one that didn't appear on any of our maps. The trees around us were too tall, their branches weaving together like twisted fingers, blocking out most of the sky. I don't like this place, Lisa muttered. Feels wrong. Come on. Ben laughed. It's just trees. But Lisa wasn't the only one who felt it. There was something off about the air. Too still. No wind, no rustling leaves. Even the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, owls, were missing. Then we found the footprints, just beyond our camp. Deep in the dirt of the trail were bare footprints. They were long, narrow, and fresh. Who the hell walks barefoot out here? Emily whispered. We followed them for a few feet before they suddenly stopped. No turning, no sign of a struggle. They just ended, like whoever left them had vanished into thin air. A chill crawled up my spine. Let's go back to camp. That night, we barely slept. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps circling our tents. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could see the shadow of someone standing there. Then, in a voice that sounded like Emily's, it whispered, "Come outside." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Emily was asleep beside me. Then the footsteps continued, moving toward Ben and Lisa's tent. A moment later, I heard Lisa scream. I tore out of the tent, flashlight in hand, just as Lisa stumbled out of hers, shaking, eyes wide with terror. "Ben's gone." We searched the entire clearing, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. His bag, his shoes, even his flashlight were still in the tent. Then Emily pointed at the trail. The footprints were back, only this time, they were Ben's. Leading into the woods, we followed them, calling his name, our voices swallowed by the oppressive silence. The footprints led us deeper into the trees, twisting and turning until we didn't recognize where we were anymore. Then, they stopped, just like the others. They ended abruptly. No sign of struggle, no blood, no clue where he had gone. Lisa started sobbing. Emily clutched my arm. "We need to leave. Now." Then we heard it. A whisper. It came from all around us, like the trees themselves were speaking. "Come outside." The same voice that had whispered to me earlier. The same not quite human tone. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached the car, speeding down the dirt road like something was chasing us. We called the police. They searched the woods for days. They never found Ben, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. That voice. "Come outside." My name is Ryan, and I know now that some places should never be explored. It was supposed to be just another camping trip. My brother Jason and our cousin Olivia. We grew up hiking these woods, setting up camp near the river, telling scary stories by the fire. But last summer, we wandered too far. We had planned a 3-day trip deep into Ravenwood Forest, a place notorious for lost hikers. People said the trees were too dense, that the paths shifted, that compasses didn't work right. We thought it was just superstition. We were wrong. The first night was quiet, too quiet. The wind barely moved through the trees, and even the insects seemed muted. Olivia noticed it first. "The woods feel wrong," she whispered. Jason rolled his eyes. "Come on, it's just the wilderness." But I felt it too. A strange pressure in the air, like we weren't alone. The second day, we found the carvings deep in the woods. Carved into the bark of an enormous oak tree were words. "He watches." Below it, tally marks. Dozens, maybe hundreds. "What the hell?" Jason muttered, running his fingers over the grooves. The air around us felt heavy, charged. I turned, scanning the trees, my stomach twisting. "Let's keep moving." That night, I woke up to the sound of branches snapping. I sat up, heart pounding. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows. Olivia and Jason were still asleep, but something was out there. Then, I saw them. Eyes, high in the trees, glinting like animal reflections. But they weren't right. They were too high, up too still, and there were too many. I grabbed Jason's shoulder. "Wake up," he groaned, rubbing his eyes. What then? He saw them too. We both froze as the eyes moved, not blinking, not swaying, just descending, as if whatever they belonged to was crawling down the trees. I shook Olivia awake. "We have to go." She barely had time to process before we heard it. A voice, low, distorted, echoing from all directions at once. "You shouldn't have come." We ran. We didn't bother packing. We sprinted through the trees, crashing through branches, breath coming in ragged gasps. The path twisted, unfamiliar, the trees closing in around us. Then Olivia screamed. Jason and I turned just in time to see hands long, skeletal fingers reaching from the darkness, dragging her backward. She clawed at the dirt, her eyes wide with terror. "Help me." We lunged forward, grabbing her arms, pulling with everything we had. And then she was free. We didn't look back. We ran until the trees thinned, until the morning sun painted the horizon. We never spoke about it after that. Never told anyone what we saw. But sometimes, at night, I wake up gasping for air, heart hammering in my chest, because I still see them, those watching eyes in the trees.